Good morning, everybody. I am Doug Silliman, the president of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, and it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the historic, venerable Cosmos Club here in Washington, D.C., to have what we hope will be a very important and informative conversation about Yemen this morning. Yemen has not been an easy country in the region, probably ever, and has a lot of issues throughout history, but the current problems in Yemen really probably started in 2014 when Yemen seemed to be on the verge of moving toward a more politically stable system of governance. But in September of that year, Ansar Allah, the Houthis, stormed into Sana'a, took over the government, and began the division of Yemen that you see currently. Attempts by countries in the region to restore the internationally recognized government to power in Yemen have not worked. The United Nations, with the help of the United States and others, has been looking for a solution, a political solution to end both the violence and the conflict. And unfortunately, Ansar Allah has attempted since 2014 to expand their control, although they were essentially stopped in Mareb militarily in 2021. And when their advance stopped, it seemed that they had lost some of the political momentum that they had gained initially. But a lot of that changed last October 7th when Hamas attacked Israel, and Israel's very harsh response gave somebody in Sana'a the idea that the Houthis really should publicly join the axis of resistance. They have specifically targeted ships, they say, with Israeli registry going to Israel in the Bab el-Mandeb, the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden. And as recently as last week, we're successful in landing a missile in central Israel. We have got two exceptional and distinguished experts to talk to you this morning, and I think what I'm going to ask them to do is correct everything that I just got wrong in my summary. But you already know them, and they're in your brochure are somewhat longer introductions. But we have in the middle His Excellency Mohammed al-Hadrami, the ambassador of the Republic of Yemen in Washington. He arrived in Washington in March of 2022. Before that, he served as the foreign minister of the Republic of Yemen and the vice foreign minister. He was here in the embassy as the deputy chief of mission before that and served for a long time in New York at the Yemeni mission. So, Mr. Ambassador, thank you for being here. We really appreciate you being here. We also have Tim Lenderking, who is the special envoy for Yemen for the United States. In addition to those current responsibilities, which he has held for several years now, he spent a significant amount of time as the deputy chief of mission and the chargé d'affaires at our embassy in Riyadh. He has been the director of the Arabian Peninsula office at the State Department, headed the Pakistan office in the State Department, and has held a number of other positions. And interestingly, he started out his career before the State Department working with American NGOs and the United Nations on sort of refugee humanitarian-focused issues. So he has got a couple of different views throughout his career. So what I'd like to do, if you'll permit me, is just ask our two speakers to set the stage and talk about what's happening right now in Yemen. So, Mr. Ambassador, if I can hand this over to you.
Well, how are you, everyone? Good morning. Thank you, Ambassador Salman, for having us here today. And I thank the Arab Gulf State Institute for organizing this timely event. And I'm also happy to see Tim, our dear friend, here with us today. You know, I've known Tim before he was an envoy and before I was an ambassador. We couldn't have been happier that President Biden chose him to lead the U.S. policy on Yemen back in 2022. We really support and thank you for your support for Yemenis, and also, most importantly, thank you for being a friend for all Yemenis. You know, the current situation in Yemen is not good, simply. 10 years of brutal war, went through stages, from a total war, humanitarian disaster, to a stage where there's no war, no peace. But at the beginning, I wanted to maybe focus on one issue before we dive into more specific incidents and issues, because it would be more complicated otherwise, which is, who are the Houthis? You know, that's a really important question, because unfortunately, after 10 years of this conflict, I could see pundits here in Washington and other places don't really know who the Houthis are. and believe that what happened in Yemen back in 2014, as you stated, was just a regular coup, an elite overturning another elite to control the structured government. And that couldn't be further from the truth. You know, the Houthis are an Iranian-backed militia, religious militia, that wanted to turn Yemen into another Iranian model state, not even a Hezbollah-like entity in Yemen. And knowing that fact would enable us to first know why the Houthis are doing what they're doing right now, and most importantly, how to stop them. You know, the Houthis have been doing whatever they can to achieve that end goal, which is turn Yemen to this autocracy-like theocracy in Yemen, where there's a supreme leader, a buffer zone, and whatever phony election. So any deal you want to do with them, if it does not really get them that, I could assure you that there will not be a willing solution that the Houthis will take to achieve peace diplomatically that would not give them that results. So for me, I think diplomacy would not work with the Houthis. That does not mean that we have to just take the military option. I don't think it's an option right now, but I'm a firm believer that without a military pressure against the Houthis, we will never reach a just, sustainable peace in Yemen. You know, that's the nature of the Houthis, and I think without distinguishing that, we will not be able to deal with them. I mean, we could cite an example of the Safir oil tanker, and I know me and Tim have been working on that for years. And knowing the end game of the Houthis, that they wanted to hold this ship hostage at the Red Sea, just resulted in knowing how to deal with them. And eventually we reached there, we defused that bomb, but at what cost? 150 million, many years of suffering and anticipating a disaster in the Red Sea, and at the end, they still have the ship, it's a new ship, but they still have that deterrent that they wanted it from the first place. So knowing that before we dive in, I think it would help, you know, just exploring the options with the Houthis. We thank the U.S. for their support for Yemen. U.S. is one of our biggest donors. Throughout the years, they contributed more than $6 billion for humanitarian work in Yemen. Just a few years back, it was $1.3 billion in 2022. It's almost $500 million now. We have the political support of the U.S., which is also good. But I believe at this time, especially after what happens in Gaza, these atrocities that are happening that complicated the whole situation, including in Yemen, I think we need a different approach. One that would be, in my opinion, helpful for the region and also for Yemen. Meaning that if we want to solve the issue in Yemen, and we could dig deep into that later on, I think we need the U.S. as a superpower, as the biggest supporters for Yemen and others in the region, to end the war in Gaza. The U.S. is the only entity, I think, that could pressure Israel to stop the atrocities that are happening now in Gaza. It's boiling the region. I mean, the Houthis, Iran, and other proxies, they're benefiting from the unchecked, unchallenged atrocities of Israel in the region. Without dealing with this head-on first, I think anything we do to solve the problems in the region will not be successful. And at the same time, we need to deal with the Houthis as a terrorist organization, an FTO designation, with the caveats of humanitarian affairs, of course. A direct support for the government to take her data back. If not take it back, at least pressure the Houthis to come and talk like they did in 2018. I think these type of policies would help. I think just relying on trying to defeat the Houthis directly would just feed into their narratives that they're now the defenders of the Palestinians, and it will not help the government of Yemen, and I think it would also not help many governments in the region. I'll stop here, and probably if we want to move on to different details, I'll be happy to answer. Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you. Tim, how does the U.S. see the current situation in Yemen? I'll just leave that question out there, and then I've got a couple of things in my head I want to talk to both of you about based on what the ambassador just said.
Doug, thanks so much for having us, and just can't echo enough our appreciation to all of you for coming out. In whatever way that you're interested in Yemen, we deeply appreciate it. And of course, anytime I can share a stage with Ambassador Hadrami, I welcome it. He is a dear friend. We are working very closely with the legitimate government in Yemen. There is only one legitimate government in Yemen. There is no other legitimate government in Yemen. There is only the recognized government that all countries, with a few exceptions, recognize as the legitimate authority in Yemen. Whatever we can do, I think, to support the Yemen government is in all of our interests. We were riding a very strong and I think positive wave for a number of years, these last couple of years, building toward an internationally recognized truce in Yemen that started in April 2022 under the UN auspices of the UN. The US strongly backed this effort. I think it's important, notwithstanding everything that the ambassador has said, to note that this truce is basically holding inside Yemen. I think that's a very significant development, and despite all of the turmoil and the literal and figurative fires that are burning around the Middle East, this truce continues to hold. It doesn't mean that there aren't people being killed inside Yemen, but there is a truce and it is basically holding. And we need to build on that. I think there are a number of options that are being looked at now because the game has changed a lot in the last year, and I certainly associate myself with what the ambassador says about the urgency of ending the conflict in Gaza and the urgency of moving toward a two-state solution for the Palestinians. This has been articulated by this administration. Those efforts, I think, are very important, and they must go forward. There's a huge amount of regional support for this. I think what we've seen in the last year is deeply troubling in a number of ways, both broader in the region, but the impact on Yemen, starting with October 7th and the decision by the Houthi leadership to really strongly identify itself with the axis of resistance, and in my view, go rogue. I mean, they broke from what was an internationally recognized peace effort in Yemen and decided to turn their focus on the Red Sea and on civilian attacks in Israel. And this has changed the game quite a bit. It's also significantly diminished any goodwill that the Houthis built up over the course of adhering to that truce. And I think that's also a key factor in when you look at the way forward. Even European countries that have been strongly or more supportive of a Houthi point of view are turning away from that embrace of the Houthis. No longer can they be seen as an underdog or having a legitimate story of marginalization. They've turned into a very significant aggressor, not only inside Yemen, but in the immediate region. It's great. It's a major accomplishment that cross-border attacks between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia have stopped thanks to this truce, and that the Saudis don't have to live in fear of those cross-border attacks. But that energy from the Houthis has been directed into the Red Sea. It's affected international commerce. It's obstructed humanitarian supplies going to the Sudanese, the Ethiopians, and most importantly to the Yemeni people. Not one single slice of bread has been produced by the Houthis for the Palestinians whom they say that they are supporting here. It has done nothing to support the Palestinian cause. It has triggered and tapped into a huge groundswell of emotion in the region that is, very worked up over what's happening in Gaza, and we cannot dispute that or wave that away. That is very important. But what we've seen, I think, in effect, is the Houthis taking that cause and using it to pursue a very narrow agenda that is a Houthi agenda. It is not a Yemeni agenda. And ultimately, the longer this goes on, it's going to create more and more problems, more and more dissonance, and more fear inside Yemen. You take just the attacks on the Red Sea, as the ambassador said, many of these attacks have nothing to do with Israeli ships. There are no Israeli flags, there are no Israeli destinations, there are no Israeli points of origin, there are no Israelis on board. We are literally in this moment working to put out a fire, not one fire, but 10 fires that are on board a smoking tanker in the middle of the Red Sea that carries 1 million barrels of oil. The Houthis set the fires and they walked away. That is arson. I mean, and so when I talk about the way that the Houthis are plundering any goodwill that they once had, that is a fitting example of the kind of activity that we're seeing and that we have to confront now in Yemen. That's one example. The second example I would point to is the rounding up and detaining of local staff, Yemeni people who are working for humanitarian organizations in Yemen, more than 100 in the last 3 months, working for NGOs, working for the United Nations, parading some of them around in front of TV cameras. Those people look emaciated. They've been badly treated. They are being, I think, abused in Houthi custody. And they're being accused of being spies. These are Yemenis who are working for the betterment of Yemen. So by brutalizing their own people and creating a major confrontation on the international seas, it's vastly complicated, I think, the peacemaking effort that we have to do. I do agree that there isn't a military solution to Yemen's conflict, and we have to be very careful about going into that line of thinking, because we don't want Yemen to return to war, even temporarily. That's, I think, a cornerstone of the way that the U.S. sees this going forward. But we have a major Houthi problem, not just for the United States, but for the region, given their aggression on the high seas and their unwillingness to de-escalate in the face of what is, blatant provocation.
If you let me stay on the topic of the Houthis for just a moment, and Mr. Ambassador, you said that the Houthis have gained enthusiasm from being much more public members of the Axis of Resistance, from now defining themselves as pro-Palestinian, particularly in the context of what's happening in Gaza right now, being anti-American as well. Obviously, part of the solution is what you have mentioned, that there needs to be a ceasefire and an end of the fighting in Gaza. But that's only the first step. So where does the government of Yemen, where does the United States, where does the international community have points of leverage, points of influence that can turn the Houthis, if you will, back toward a negotiated settlement and something that is more, how can I put this, that is more stable for the longer term for Yemenis? So maybe that the question, where do you see leverage that your government has, that the United States government has, and the international community has? And Tim, I'll ask you to answer the same question.
The Houthis, if they know something better, is just to wage war. And if we could convince the Houthis to come to peace talks, then they'll be the weakest people in the room, because nobody could convince populations in Yemen that a divine right to rule is the right way. They're not going to change to a political party. A multi-party system in Yemen is not for their benefit. So taking the Houthis into peace talks and settlement and ending the conflict is not something that they want to do willingly. That's the issue there. Before October 7th, to understand why the Houthis did what they did, you need to understand what happened before. The Saudis and the Houthis were talking. There was a roadmap. It wasn't a good one, to be honest. But it was something that the government of Yemen was willing to go with because it's the only way for peace. We understand the Houthis. We know that they're not going to sign a peace deal that is ready for all Yemenis for elections. They're not ready for this. But after 10 years of war, we were willing to take it, even though it wasn't a good plan. But to answer your question, how do we realize it? So when before October 7th, there was a lot of pressure on the Houthis. They were talking to the Saudis. There is no aggressor anymore to collect this illicit taxes, to not pay salaries, to be very brutal on the dissents just by citing, you're with the Saudis, you're with the Americans. They cannot do this anymore before October 7th because there were talks and there were peace plans. And guess what happened? October 7th happened. And Israel just went rogue on the Palestinians in Gaza. And the Houthis just took it. They stopped everything and focused in gaining sympathies within Yemen, within the region, and just abandoning all what they have agreed to do in the past. So how do we get them back to this? Again, I think it's military pressure. We will fight the Houthis because they're aggressors in Yemen. We will try to liberate Hodeidah, for Yemenis. We need to delink that, just not talk about how we can actually do something that would affect the problems in Gaza. We need to end the war in Gaza. But the Houthis cannot just run away from talking peace in Yemen, citing Gaza as the solution. I think that's not the way to go.
Mr. Ambassador, maybe let me ask a more specific question, because I certainly sensed after the military stalemate in Shabwa and Marib in 2021, 2022, that the Houthis, while engaged in peace talks, were not doing particularly well in governance of the areas that they were in control of, and therefore they were losing some public support. Well, first of all, my question is that impression correct? And is that one way to hopefully removing the excuse of Gaza from their objective? How can you weaken the political support for the Houthis in the parts of Yemen that they rule over?
You know, I'm not sure how you define political support for the Houthis. I mean, they rule with an iron fist. I mean, if you have an honest elections or polls in Yemen, if people in Sana'a could actually march the street, they even celebrate the 26th of September revolution, which is coming up soon. The Houthis would not like it. The Houthis would not allow them to do so. And there's no freedoms in Yemen to genuinely gauge if there is support for the Houthis. I know for sure, all the family I know, all the friends I know are in Yemen, and nobody likes the Houthis, and for good reasons. So there is no support for the Houthis unless you're benefiting from the Houthis in Yemen. I know this for a fact. So how to get them back to talk peace and to return to the negotiations? I don't see any way diplomatically is possible to do that with the Houthis. They need to be pressured. And I'll give you an example. Back in 2018, we, with the help of the coalition, the Saudi-led coalitions, were about to get the Hodeidah port. And there was an effort, was supported. We were a few kilometers from the port. And the Houthis just called the envoy, called everybody, and ran to Sweden. They were ready to talk peace, not because they want peace.
Not this envoy.
They were, yeah, the UN envoy. They were ready to talk peace because they were pressured. We went to Sweden. We were pressured in Sweden to sign that Hodeidah deal that never was realized. It was a good deal, but it wasn't. Nobody could actually implement it in the ground. And look at UN Maha now in Hodeidah. It's doing nothing. The UN is doing nothing in Hodeidah. The plan was to demilitarize Hodeidah port. Look at Hodeidah port. It's the base of the attacks on the Red Sea now. So it's a lost opportunity, but you want to get the Houthis back to the table, you need another pressure. And that's my point from the beginning.
Tim, let me divide that same question into two parts for you, because the United States has been simultaneously trying to degrade the Houthis' capabilities to conduct these attacks in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, but also trying to push them back toward discussion of furthering the truce and peace talks. So where does the United States or where does the international community have leverage to stop the attacks in the Red Sea, if that can be done? And then how do you get the Houthis back to the table?
It's true that we are conducting with a small coalition of countries military strikes to degrade Houthi military capability. It's very narrowly focused at this time. It is focused on those capabilities that the Houthis have to conduct attacks on Red Sea, and President Biden has made it very clear those are the parameters of those strikes. And those are ongoing, and they have done, I think, a great deal of damage to Houthi military capability, but the Houthis are able to resupply. There are just too many holes in the pipeline. They can get small and large equipment coming on small boats from Iran into Yemen, and you can use those parts and harness it with their indigenous capability. I mean, they have learned from the model of Hezbollah and other actors in the region how to put things together and make them fire a long way and hit a target. And they're getting very good at it. And that's a troubling, a troubling development. They're also partnering now across ideological lines with terrorist groups like Al-Shabaab in Somalia. What they're doing, I think, with the Russian relationship is extremely troubling. But at the end of the day, I think I still subscribe, we do as a country, as an administration, to the notion that we have to push them back into a more, certainly a de-escalatory stance. There are a couple of things that the Houthis want from the international community. They do not know how to govern. They do not know how to feed the population. They can't do that without international support. And there's a tremendous humanitarian apparatus and effort that's in place to help feed the Yemeni people, right, who also rely on, commercial imports and things like that. But there is, a very significant humanitarian crisis in Yemen. Again, I go back to why would the Houthis then detain all of these humanitarian workers whose sole mission is professionally is to try and move food and medicine and fuel to their own people. A few months ago, we noticed that the Houthis started using their own letterhead to send letters to the United Nations and other organizations saying, hey, we're asking for this and we want a seat at the UN General Assembly. And the unknowing amongst the recipients of this letterhead thought this was the legitimate government. Well, the Houthis, I think, are trying to pose as the legitimate government, but nobody is really fooled by this. The point being, I think there is an effort to try and demonstrate some legitimacy, but it's hollow. It rests on very little popularity. Again, I think as the ambassador says, this is not a group that would win an election in Yemen. They rule by force, they rule by intimidation. You look at those detentions as a perfect case in point. It's critical that wherever we go from here, moving back toward a peace effort, the regional countries have a significant role to play, and there's not a country in the immediate vicinity that doesn't want to see a genuine peace in Yemen, and some are working actively to do that. Saudi Arabia is doing that. Oman is doing that. And these are crucial partners in this effort. They all have contacts with the Houthis, and they all need to use those, I think, to help with the challenges that we face in terms of de-escalation. So it's a regional problem, and I'm glad to say that we have such strong partners in the region, apart from the Yemeni government, to work on this problem set. We need more help in the UN Security Council. And that's where, unfortunately, the issue of Gaza continues to make things more difficult. The relationship between the Russians and the United States has a negative blowback in Yemen also, where we see the Russians increasingly going their own way, breaking from what has been a P5 consensus, China, Russia, the US, Britain, and France, where we have actually worked together and we continue to meet as a group to discuss a way forward in Yemen. But I think, given the fact the Russians are very irritated with our strong policy on Ukraine, they're finding other outlets to take it out on us. And Yemen is another venue where have been seeking to arm the Houthis, which would be a game changer. So there is a lot of diplomatic space that needs to be pushed on further. Next week at the UN General Assembly, we'll be taking up a lot of these issues.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, let me follow up on what Tim just said, because I have been a bit surprised by the growing international relations of the Houthis. With terrorist organizations, there was a Carnegie Endowment report I read this week that Russia now has military advisors in Sana'a. It's clear that Iran has worked with the Houthis to increase their military capabilities, and there were reports I saw, I assume they're true, but I don't know, that Iran was also providing intelligence to the Houthis on potential ships that might have some connection to Israel that they might wish to go after at some point. So can you talk about this network that the Houthis have developed and why you now have, where Russia stands, how Iran views the Houthis from the standpoint of the Yemen government, and what other problematic relationships have you seen the Houthis developing?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest supporters of the Houthis are the Iranians. They've been supplying them with weapons, expertise, even before the war began. I mean, that was even way back. So we know the experts from Hezbollah and Iran are in Yemen. The Iranians used to deny it for a while when they don't want to use it, but then at some point in time, they just pulled the Houthi card and used it in some of the negotiations they had back in, I think, 2018, 2019. I was, when I was a minister, just being talked to by other ministers that, oh, now Iran wants to help in the Yemeni file because, it's known. They've been supplying them, and it's the biggest supporters for them. As for the Russian connection, we heard the reports. We were concerned of having a Russian assistant to the Houthis. That was really worrisome. So we contacted the Russian directly. Our foreign minister was in Russia. He was invited to go there, and he asked that directly, and the Russian denied it. We take their word for it. I mean, they say they support Yemen. We want a unity in the Security Council. It's something that we always cherished. We know that a united front in the Security Council for Yemen is a blessing. Other countries are not fortunate enough to have this. Given the complexity of international relations in the Security Council, it's good to have everybody on your side in the Security Council. And I hope it would continue to be so in the Security Council. As for Al-Shabaab and other terrorist organizations, we know that the Houthis were working with Al-Qaeda in Yemen. I've heard it from generals in Yemen that in some battlegrounds near Al-Baida and Marib and other places, Houthis and Al-Qaeda used to coordinate their attacks against the government of Yemen. So we know that there was a connection domestically between the Houthis and Al-Qaeda. As soon as the Houthis took Sana'a, apparently many Al-Qaeda prisoners just went missing. And now we hear reports about them connecting with the Shabaab in Somalia, which is also worrisome, and other reports about Sudan, but I'm not privy of information to confirm either of these reports. But we do have and hear some genuine reports about the outreach of the Iranians through the Houthis to these supported terrorist groups by Iran, and now through the Houthis, like what they did with the Houthis with Hezbollah before through the Red Sea. So it's a whole network as I see it. And the closest to whatever terrorist organization supported by Iran is actually used by Iran.
Tim, let me ask sort of one final question on the international aspect of Yemen. And where do you see, what is the status of the UN-led talks to expand the truce? What is the UN doing with the Houthis to try to deter them, I presume, from firing on ships in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb, and is there any energy, any forward movement at all since October 7th, or since the Houthis became so publicly one of the core members of the Axis of Resistance?
The UN-led effort is still active, but the ambassador referred a few minutes ago to the roadmap, and I think the international community has come to the same conclusion simultaneously, that how can we support implementation of the roadmap? And I know the ambassador is right when he says it's imperfect and not everybody likes it. But how could we support a roadmap when one of the key parties is acting in such an aggressive way on the international stage, not just sort of bruising Yemen, but also being so confrontational in its attacks on civilians and attacks on the Red Sea. So it's difficult, I think, for that to go forward, at least until the Houthis stop their attacks on the Red Sea. And I think at that point, you have to evaluate, what have we seen over the last year? Is that group that's behaving like that fit to be part of a political negotiation? I think the international community will want to see, and mostly it's the Yemeni people that the Houthis, I think, have to answer to. But there will be, I think, a strong interest in trying to move to a political negotiation, absent a military confrontation. But it's very difficult with these worrying ties that we've talked about with the Houthis on the international stage, the Russians, Al-Shabaab, and of course the Iranians. I mean, the Iranians are a key player and a malign actor here in this situation with their personnel in Sana'a, their trainers, their advisors. Everything I hear from the Yemeni people is that they want these people out of Yemen. They do not want Iranian militants inside their country. So they should leave. If they want to show a genuine support for a Yemeni peace process, what are they doing there? And we would have the same thing to say about, Russians playing the same role. That sounds like a bad move. So we need. I know that the UN envoy is in Tehran at the moment. He's maintaining contacts with all the parties, with the Russians, with the Iranians, with the Yemen government, with the Houthis. It's important that these channels remain open. You will never hear me as a career diplomat saying we can't talk to people. We have to talk to people. And I believe there's still a wide space for the U.S. to play a very positive role, and we look forward to do that. We are undeterred. We are the axis of persistence.
Nice.
So, Mr. Ambassador, I'd like to bring the conversation really into Yemen and talk about what's happening now in Yemen. And I want to start with politics, because the government of Yemen has essentially decamped to Aden. You're not in the areas that are controlled by the Houthis. But there have been persistent reports of personality differences, lack of cooperation between the Presidential Leadership Council, the Southern Transitional Council. Can you tell me areas in which, where does the government agree on policy for Yemen, whether it is economic policy, humanitarian policy, negotiating positions, international relations? Where is there a consensus in the government on a way forward for Yemen? And how can, for Tim later, how can the United States or the international community help strengthen this consensus in the government of Yemen?
Yeah, thank you very much. Of course there's differences, and because everyone is in a coalition against the Houthis, and we can't just have everything under agreement. This is democracy. We have Islamists, we have the Southern Transition Council, we have so many parties just gathered around forming the Presidential Leadership Council back in April 2022, which was a very good move, hopefully to uniting the front against the Houthis. We do have differences, challenges, but we're working through them. And I know that we're all united in confronting the Houthis and returning to democracy, where all these political parties could settle their differences in Congress or in our parliament, not with battles. It's different than the Houthis because there's no dissent in the Houthis. You can't just mistake what's happening in the Houthis and not see in public dissent or differences as assuming that they're actually doing well. It's the opposite. You could look at the politics in this country, which we see as an example. So in that sense, yes, we have major differences, challenges, but we're working together through them. The Southern Transitional Council is now part of the Presidential Leadership Council, which is a good thing. Did that answer your question? Was there something else?
I've got a couple more. I want to drill down a bit more on specific topics. But Tim, for you, looking at this from outside and as part of an international actor trying to help stabilize and bring peace and more prosperity to Yemen, how does the United States deal with this interestingly composed government now sitting in Aden? And how have they been cooperative in the peace process, the discussions that you've been involved in Saudi Arabia and in Oman? And is there anything more the United States can do to bring that group to more cohesion on key topics?
Well, certainly the Presidential Leadership Council, which is the head of the Yemen government, is a coalition that we have to continue to support. We want to continue to support. They need resources. They need political support. They need international visitors going to Yemen to meet with them, showing that we have solidarity and can visit them in their headquarters in Aden. But they also need a tremendous amount of financial support, economic support. Unfortunately, as part of what the Houthis have done to Yemen and to Yemenis is cut off Yemen's ability to export its own oil and its own energy products by firing on ships several years ago, which made all the ships pull back and say, we're not going to go there, and start loading up on products from Yemen's pipelines and risk getting shot at by the Houthis. So this is another way in which we feel that the Houthis have hurt Yemen. There is a capability to get Yemen's economy back online, and that's got to be a part of what happens going forward. We need to see that happen because the negative economic situation in Yemen is literally affecting all Yemenis. This is not a country that wants to rely on humanitarian support and handouts. And I thank the American people for being so generous to give to Yemen's humanitarian, crisis in a way that's quite impressive. But this isn't the way to go ultimately. I mean, Yemen has some resources. I was talking with a Yemeni the other day as we were, hiking in a park here about the raw beauty of this country. If you haven't been, it has tremendous appeal as a country that could attract, more tourism. We've got to help Yemen, I think, get back on its feet. That's what the United States can do more than any other country, I think. And our ability to lead an international effort to do this, nobody else can do that. That is the United States. And even as flawed as we are in the region, I think there's still huge space for us to maneuver. And I think other countries appreciate and welcome our leadership. I certainly get that sense from the Yemeni people.
So, Mr. Ambassador, Tim opened the question I wanted to address to you next, which is, can you describe to us sort of what the Yemeni people are feeling in terms of their economic humanitarian situation? Oil exports are not happening. The government of Yemen and Yemen has very few options to make money. Where in the country are things working better? Where do you have access to outside goods? Where is their cash flow? And where is the situation most dire? I'll just leave the question there. So, and maybe what is the government of Yemen doing to try to help the situation of average Yemenis, at least in terms of daily life, being able to get food and clean water and the things that they need for their life?
People are fed up. It's a brutal war. The humanitarian crisis is a real thing. And people want peace. We need to live like other people in the world. We have, as you said, Yemen is blessed with a great location and strategic location, which now it's becoming a curse on Yemenis. We have so many beauties in Yemen. History, our cuisines are really nice. We have really a couple of good restaurants here for if anyone is interested. We have so much to offer in Yemen. And I genuinely believe we could be leading in the region. We shouldn't be asking for charity. We shouldn't be asking for help. We should be the ones who are giving help and exporting the wealth of our civilizations. But at the same time, Yemenis are not ready to give up their freedoms. I could see it in the defiance of so many people I know in Sana'a and other people. Yes, we want peace, but we want a just peace. Access of food and other materials is there. You could see the shops are filled with everything, but people cannot buy it. Inflation is a problem. We used to pay salaries under the Houthis until the Houthis put this dichotomy of the currency and prevented us from doing so. As Tim mentioned, in October 2022, the Houthis even prevented the government from exporting whatever meager resources we have through oil. We lost $2 billion since then. We had issues, to be completely honest, before the formation of the Presidential Leadership Council, infighting actually before that. And that was one of the major problems for us with all the help from the Saudis and the Saudi coalition that prevented us from defeating the Houthis. That was one of the main issues, which is the infightings between those who were opposing the Houthis. But that changed after the formation of the Presidential Leadership Council. But 6 months in, and the Houthis cut off 65% of our revenues. And whatever meager resources we have education, we have health system, we have salaries, we have roads to pay. We want to, just be responsible for the people. And you can't wage war with no money. And without money to pay salaries, you're reliant on others to help you. And that just gets so complicated. So I reiterate what Tim says. We need support for the government. We need embassies to open in Aden. I think that would really send a really strong signal. We need people to treat the government as a legitimate government, and I tell you, we have the men, we have the willingness, and we do have the ability to confront the Houthis. We're just lacking support.
Tim, let me ask you a sort of variation on that question, because there are a lot of groups inside Yemen who feel that the conflict with the Houthis, the movement of the government, the displacement of population, the dire humanitarian circumstances has really taken their issues, whether they be women's rights movements, family movements, education. What are the key social issues that you see that need to be addressed in Yemen, either that are getting addressed in some way or that need more international help or more focus from the international community to move forward?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the role of women, because as part of my job, we've had the fortune of meeting so many dynamic Yemeni women, both in Yemen and in the diaspora in Washington, D.C., who are working from whatever place they live on issues that to improve the lives of Yemenis. We've talked about the importance of, when there is a Yemen peace process, the role of women, their voices need to be fully incorporated, and not just later, but now. I mean, working on that process. We've had some fantastic engagements with Yemeni youth groups, who I think have really done a great job of articulating their concerns, their needs, their perspective on things. We've had fascinating conversations with engineers working in Yemen who are trying to, build water supplies in a country that is being written more and more about as one that's going to be in the eye of the storm in the Middle East region in terms of climate change, right? We need to get to the point as a world community, and I think as Yemenis, where we could move beyond the current conflict and really address some of these longer term challenges. So what I've found is that Yemeni people are so eager to have a conversation, a vote, and a voice in what's going on. And I think the more we can tap that energy, which is tremendous. You have a very vibrant Yemeni diaspora community in Cairo and Amman, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia, and Dearborn, Michigan. And those, spending time with those Yemenis is a fantastic experience. They love this country. They love Yemen too, and they know Yemen. And they, are sending remittances back. Some of them are lucky enough to travel back there, to have their inputs and their perspective is a marvelous thing. One thing I think that has been so problematic, though, in the current situation is the impediments that the Houthis have placed on female humanitarian workers, not allowing them to participate in doing field research, surveys, follow up on programs without a male minder. I mean, this is going backward. This is like a core humanitarian principle. If you want women to participate, do the follow-up on the health sector and education and other areas, let them do their jobs. But there are more and more tighter regulations coming from the Houthi quote-unquote humanitarian organization in Sana'a, restricting the roles of women to play their part. And I think that's part of the negative trend that we're seeing.
So let me open up the floor for a few questions. So I will ask, sort of raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Please wait until someone brings a microphone to you so we will have a good audio on the question that you ask. And if you want to direct a question to one of the two panelists, please do so. I also ask that you keep your questions as short as possible and make sure that there's a question in there as well so that we can get as many different opinions. So we'll start right here with the two of you at this table first, the first two questions.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. I had the honor to serve as a member of the National Dialogue before all of this conflict, unfortunately, enclaved Yemen. My question is simply about, since the beginning of the Biden administration and coming into having what the ambassador mentioned is the roadmap to reach peace, a lot of Yemenis felt that the Biden administration is not dealing with the situation as war could be an eventuality, not because the U.S. wants it, but mainly because maybe the Houthis want to have that eventuality. And since the war in Gaza is boiling, as the ambassador mentioned. It's boiling the region. The Houthis have took that opportunity to actually get more excited and trying to excite the population, to recruit more people to launch these attacks. And the question is, have the United States saw that there was something missing in the approach since the beginning of the Biden administration when we were heading towards a peace plan, that simply, if you want peace, you need to also be prepared to have war? And finally, the second part of my question is, we also have a problem in Yemen because the political vibrant environment that existed in Yemen before 2014, where we had political parties operating, where we had the parliament, is not there right now. And we have a lot of Yemenis who actually want to see civil society working. Even what means of supporting or actually as a deterrent against the Houthis is actually to have that vibrant environment kind of revived in the areas that the Houthis do not control. So one way that I can see that the United States can play an active role is actually if encouraging the political parties to start reoperating in the areas that the Houthis do not control, seeing the parliaments operate, or strengthening the institutions that actually would strengthen political practices in Yemen. Because in my opinion, Yemen can only be stable when we have democratic practices. When we saw for many, many years, many of the people that you see fighting, they stood actually in line, waiting to cast their vote in the ballot box, and actually waiting and talking to their representatives in parliament. That's the only way that Yemen can actually have a form of stability. And that's the future that actually, when people talk about peace in Yemen, that's what they want to see. That's the end goal that they want to achieve.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll boil that down to sort of two questions. Will the promotion of democratic institutions, civil society, public activism in the area that the government controls be good pressure on the Houthis and develop, strengthen institutions in Yemen? And maybe the first one is sometimes you have to go to war to make peace. Is that something that is currently being contemplated more seriously? If I misrepresented your questions, let me know. That's what I heard.
We need to be prepared.
Okay, so Mr. Ambassador, you can go first, and then Tim, you can.
I mean, I agree with most of what he mentioned very eloquently about Yemen. I mean, we need a vibrant society, but we need to feed the people too. And if we don't have money as a government, I don't see how we can make this happen. We need war to end all wars. We need to convince the Houthis that their only option to exist in Yemen is through peace. And they have to settle for this. And they will not do it without military pressure, in my opinion. But we can't just go fledging war right now with no aim. The aim has to be peace. And we need to build a lot of pressure, other options, second plan, to actually convince the Houthis that is the only way. And we need our allies and we need our partners to be able to do this. In terms of the economic front, by allowing us to export oil, or just delivering on the deposits that are promised, and also opening the embassies, supporting the Yemeni government army to actually be strong enough to confront the Houthis, and these type of things.
So Tim, preparing military pressure on the Houthis and strengthening democratic institutions and civil society. How does the U.S. approach these, and frankly, how does the international community see these?
Yeah. I mean, my first trip to Sana'a was in early 2014, and it was a fantastic experience to be there, be part of the national dialogue which was happening, and all these political parties meeting in Sana'a, and just the atmosphere was kind of electric. And you know that this country has the capability and the desire and the energy to work beyond the differences that exist. And so, getting back to that in some way, I'm not going to say it was a perfect process, but the Houthis sort of torpedoed that good moment. So what I sense from Yemenis is a lot of desire to to strengthen institutions inside the country. Many Yemenis, I think, believe in them, and they are a counterbalance to the way that the Houthis purvey influence, which is through a very narrow, self-serving, campaign of intimidation, garnering resources for themselves, behaving in a corrupt manner which I think is increasingly evident to many Yemeni people. But this march can only be supported, I think, by strong support from the international community. So the more ways that we can plug in at the popular level in Yemen through NGOs and through the important work of the UN inside the country is going to be beneficial. Nobody's showed us. There's a lot of talk about returning to war and military pressure. Nobody's produced a plan that has any credibility so far on how you do that. It's one thing to be able to say that, but it's another thing to actually have a game plan, and there isn't one. And I think the United States will be very reluctant to support any talk of returning to war, even if it's the way that some of you might argue it gets us to where we need to go eventually. Yes, I think there is more pressure on the Houthis that certainly needs to be exerted. And I think there's a growing consensus in the U.S. government in this administration, which embraced a peace plan earlier, but now has also seen the ways that the Houthis behave on the international scene. And many Yemenis are saying, we told you so. We knew these Houthis before. You didn't believe us. But look, these are their true colors. And I think we're all having to adapt to this new reality on the high seas. Who are these guys, and what is the best strategy to move Yemen towards stability and peace in the future?
Second question here, please also introduce yourself. I failed to mention that.
My name is Nadwa Dosari, and I'm a Yemeni first, and I'm a non-resident scholar with the Middle East Institute. My friend Baran and I here have been accused by the Houthis of being spies for the Mossad and the CIA, simply because we've devoted our lives to promote democracy and peace building in our country. Thank you, Ambassador Mohammed Hadrami. I absolutely agree with everything you said, and thank you, Tim. I was one of the people who said, I told you so. I appreciate all your efforts. My question, I was going to ask the same question that Barak said, but my question is, at what point will we realize that the peace process in Yemen has become counterproductive? The Stockholm Agreement was one huge, it was a turning point in Yemen. It's the reason why the Houthis are now attacking ships in the Red Sea, and why they have made so many military gains that it's impossible to bring them to the table, because we don't have the leverage on them, and we have to build that leverage on them. Hans, the UN envoy, has been denied a visa to Sana'a. That's how much interested the Houthis are in peace. They've denied the UN envoy a visa to Sana'a to go visit to them and talk to them. Will the US, if there's a roadmap, and clearly the roadmap is just simply a way for the Saudis to exit Yemen, and practically it will mean handing Yemen over to the Houthis on a silver plate. Will the US stand behind that, knowing that this roadmap only means that the Houthis will take Yemen, and they're not going to be contained in Yemen. The Houthis have big plans for the region. Their ultimate goal is Jerusalem, and this is their ideology. This is what drives them, and and in such a scenario, the U.S. will be complicit with destroying Yemen. So at what point will the U.S. sort of take a step back and kind of examine things, and its sort of blind support for the peace process, which I think is deeply flawed?
Let me add a specific point to that, because the question started with, is the international peace process actually counterproductive for Yemen? I look back to the brokered deal from July, which essentially pressured the government of Yemen to restart transactions with Houthi areas, because of the humanitarian impact of cutting off this. So is this one example where you have conflicting goals, one of which is maybe to help Yemenis who live under Houthi rule, but you also, to solve that for the long term, you have to somehow break the ability of the Houthis to control. So again, one specific example, I don't know if it fits in with your question, Nedwa, but...
I agree with what Nedwa said. With regard to the examples and the measures that would start with the central bank, I think that's what you mentioned. You know, we never really actually wanted to stop remittances, for example, to areas with the Houthis. I mean, the aim was not to hinder and punish the people. You know, the Houthis, with their careless management of the fiscal policy in terms of, you know, initiating new currency, putting so much pressure on private bankings, you know, resulted in that the central bank needed to take measures to actually persuade the Houthis not to continue in that vein. You know, one of the issues that we face is that we cease the ability to send salaries to those in Sana'a because of these measures. And it was hurting the economy. And it was really hurting, you know, how people actually conduct business. You know, the deal came in, the Houthis retracted in some of these areas, and we didn't actually stop these measures, we just delayed them to a later point. So the pressure is still there on the Houthis, but we don't want to punish the people. So it needs to be calculated again, but it's still on the table, if that answers the concerns and the question.
Maybe answering Nedwa's broader point.
There's no way, Nadwa, I think that this administration, I can't speak for the next administration, but this administration wants to turn Yemen over to the Houthis. And I think there's a fresh look happening now at all of our assumptions and our projections and how we can drive this process forward, or a new process, without destroying some of the positive things that have happened. I mean, the fact that there was a major prisoner release a year ago that was negotiated between the Houthis, the Yemeni government, and the Saudis, I think is very positive. There's still many more prisoners that need to be released. There needs to be some sort of reckoning about how to bring Yemen's economy back online. The Houthis cannot continue to strangle Yemen's growth and get away with it. So I do think there is an important fresh look that's happening at this time.
To the next table back, woman in the red blouse. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Mirat Mabrouk. I lead Egypt and Horn of Africa at the Middle East Institute. Ambassador, you touched on this briefly, but perhaps specific would help. You said that pressure needs to be brought to bear against the Houthis. How? Right? What exactly would you like to see, rather than sanctions, rather than that? And how do you expect the international community to weigh in on this? How do we move forward on this? Because you did say this doesn't appear to be going anywhere. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I could go to specifics. I mean, we've thought of so many ways to pressure the Houthis. One is FTO designation. I know if the Houthis are designated as a foreign terrorist organization, that would pressure the Houthis to come to peace. Of course, we need to put some caveats for humanitarian efforts not to be impeded. But that one specific way in shattering the illusions of the Houthis that they would be recognized. I mean, they're sending phony letters to the UN ever since 2016 and 17, just thinking that they will just get a seat just like that. So designate them as a foreign terrorist organization would do and put so much pressure on them. That's one. Second, we thank the United States for helping the Coastal Guard. That was really a good step. And it's really good to, it's not directly military pressure against the Houthis, but it would actually pressure the supply of weaponry that goes to them. But sea is only half of the picture here. We need to also secure the borders. And I know that we're actually engaged with the Department of Defense in actually increasing support for our border control, which will happen soon. And there's a delegation coming up perhaps next month to just discuss about this issue. So, another pressure would also be securing Yemen through the assistance that we get from the US and others in terms of patrol, in terms of just cutting off the Iranian support to Yemenis. You see, these are specific things that could actually help us. A third one is implementing Hodeidah agreement by force. It doesn't mean that we would just go and invade Hodeidah. It means that the international community, for example, would just say, we have a Hodeidah agreement, we have a Stockholm agreement, the Houthis reneged, Now we'll just, under Chapter 7, we'll just have to implement it. And to do so, we'll have to support the government's troops to implement it by force if the Houthis refuse to demilitarize Hodeidah port. That's a specific point that could be embraced by the Security Council in a session. It could be actually done in a resolution. And that would put immense pressure, because if the Houthis would think that they would lose Hodeidah, for example, they would just come running for peace. And probably they would get the envoy visa.
And on the side, across it in the gray suit.
Thanks very much. My name's Tom Watkins. I'm with the National newspaper. Question for question for each of you, actually, please. Mr. Lenderking, there's been a lot of reporting lately about the US potentially offering enticements, including a Houthi claim on Monday that the US will recognise the Houthi government in Sana'a. Has the US offered to recognise the government in any capacity, the Houthi government in any capacity at all? If not, what enticements can you offer them to get them to the negotiating table? And for the ambassador, I'd like to draw you out a little bit more on some of your comments. You said at the top that diplomacy will not work with the Houthis, sorry. And then Mr. Lenderking's obviously been quite adamant that there's no military solution, as a top diplomat would say. Could you, and then you did answer the question a little bit just in with the previous question, but when you say diplomacy will not work, are you talking more about, like, you want to ramp up military pressure? Could you just go into that a little bit more, please?
Yeah, I mean, what I said was diplomacy alone will not help. So, of course, we need to get to a peaceful deal. But diplomacy alone will not get us that deal. So we will get to it with diplomacy, but you have to have military pressure to help you. So I agree that a military option is out of the picture, and I think it's for a good reason. But you have to have something. You have to have something to pressure the Houthis to come to an agreement to do something against their ideology. And without military pressure, I mean, I don't know if we could do some magic to convince them, but that's the only option I have. And I think it would be feasible in that situation.
Tom, there is no truth to the story that you cited or those reports, so I hope you will just help us kill that story. It is not the case that the U.S. is offering any inducements to recognize the Houthis as a legitimate government. We don't see that as a reasonable objective in any case, but what happens to Yemen's government, we believe, is an outgrowth of a conversation that Yemenis have. They decide who divides up the resources, how their government is formed, whether it's a north-south government or a federal government. That's something that we feel Yemenis have to decide for themselves. We want to help Yemen get to that point.
Sorry, one follow-up, if I may. Thank you for those responses. There was a little bit of a divergence as well on Russia. The ambassador said that you take Russia's word for it. Why would you take Russia's word for it? And Mr. Lenderking, you said that you have indeed been seeing Russia aiming to, or at least, or I don't know if you said that they have already or that are planning to help the Houthis. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we heard the reports. We were concerned. We expressed our concern to the Russians. They invited the foreign minister. He went there and they spoke to them. I mean, we're not just going to take their word for it, but we haven't seen something else in there. You know, if there is evidence, or we've seen some of the actual experts or actual weaponry of Russians, then we'll have a different story. But as you know, we need the Russians in the Security Council. We don't want to alienate them altogether by rushing to a position. So we expressed that concern. We went there and we were told, and we just took it. If there's something else, if we see evidence that this is not the case, I think our position will change, of course.
We have seen enough very worrying evidence that backs up, the charge that I made. So we do see that Russia is definitely reaching out in a more lethal way to the Houthis. We hope that this won't go anywhere. We've definitely alerted our regional allies to this. We've had conversations in multiple capitals about this.
Other questions? Liz, here in the front, the gray jacket.
Hi, Liz Dent with the Washington Institute. I have two questions, and I think that they're both for Special Envoy Linder King. The first is, it's been a while since we've seen the sort of joint coalition strikes in Yemen against the Houthis, the US-UK-led strikes. I want to say it's been since April. I'm not sure if that's correct. I know that we just had another missile from the Houthis land in central Israel. My sort of expectation was that the US-UK strikes were discontinued for a while after the Israeli strikes on the port of Hodeidah. Do we expect there to be another response from the Israelis against the Houthis after this latest missile attack? And if so, what do we expect that the calculus will be for the US and the UK to continue its coalition? And then secondly, is there anything that you can share with us on the So-Union negotiations? Why did the Houthis allow for a salvage operation? It seems sort of contrary to their nature. Thank you.
Well, on the first one, Liz, we don't know exactly how the Israelis will respond. I think they've indicated that they will respond, but we're also concerned about a perpetual cycle of firing on each other that is just going to feed the whole international or the regional crisis here. So there's some concern about that. But the fact that the Houthis have clearly demonstrated a capability to hit Israel, and their behavior is very reckless at this particular time. We see no concern about civilian deaths. We don't see that either when they fire toward Israel or certainly on the high seas. They've killed a number of mariners already. They've sunk one ship. They've set this other ship on fire. Even while there was a salvage effort underway, which they initially blocked by sending threatening messages to the crew of the tugboats, they are firing at other ships around the burning tanker. So this is still a very volatile situation. I think what happened was that there was a very strong international response that kicked into high gear very, very quickly. U.S. leadership was very much part of this effort. And there were some, back channel conversations that happened to make sure that the Houthis would support this effort. It's not in their interest to see a major oil spill that would damage Yemen's, fishing industry. And so forth. So, very cautiously, fingers crossed, the ship has been towed out of that area. It's still on fire. The firefighting equipment hasn't reached the ship yet. It needs to do that so the fires can be put out. We see it very much as a live threat still, because the oil is still on board the tanker, and you do have a very difficult and volatile regional situation that could turn in a less helpful direction at any moment. You did ask about the military coalition, and of course it's still holds together as a group of like-minded countries that feels that there has to be some military pressure on the Houthis on their capability firing on Red Sea. So I think you will continue to see that coalition operating to achieve that objective.
Okay, next over here to Ambassador Roebuck. Bill?
Tim, I have a question for you. What about the ambassador's suggestion about reinstituting the FTO designation for the Houthis? Is there thinking about that in the U.S. government?
I mean, I think, we designated the Houthis under one category last January, February, specially designated global terrorist, SDGT. There is a higher grade or higher octane designation. We're in, very active conversation with the Yemen government, within our own leadership here about the prospect of doing that, whether that's helpful, whether that achieves objectives that we want to see. So that issue is still on the table.
Next question over here, back in the first table.
Morning, Wathik Hammam from Embassy of Iraq. Thank you for this event, and it's a very timely event and very good information we got. But Your Excellency, when you were talking about the military pressure, that reminds me the debate that we had in 2020 around Houthis and whether it was their choice, to engage within this regional and international, game attacking in the Red Sea, and then we don't see, from point to another, that, their end game, whether on national or international level. If they will, decide today to stop all these attacks and then not engage with the, the acts of resistance that, took the whole region, do you think that it's their, call now, or they can decide themselves this time?
Well, I mean, if the Houthis want peace, we could be back in Sana'a in a few days. I mean, institutions are there. Everything is there. We have the dialogue, which our friend participated in. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best we can get. So we're not like other countries without naming names. We have institutions. We have political parties system since 1990s, and everybody's ready just to go back and work. But, it's up to the Houthis to decide. I know from what I know that they will not do it without any military pressure. That's why we need the FDO. We need even direct, hit for the leadership. I wouldn't even rule that out. I mean, if that's what it takes to get Yemen back to peace, I think it would be a good strategy to do. They need to be treated as a terrorist organizations until they're not a terrorist organization. That's what I would say as a Yemeni, and I would fully support it. If they do decide for some reason to go back to peace, I mean, we could do it now. We could do it today. I mean, our hand is extended from day one, and with our partners. The issue was always the Houthis trying to get more, and the end game is to transform Yemen to another Iran, and that is impossible for us to accept, because we'll be just selling the future of our kids and the future of their kids. And I hope that just answered the question that she posed. I'm not sure if there was another question in the comment, but I hope that answered the question.
Okay, so this will be the last question. Look at the center tables, because we've had little participation. Okay, we'll go back to Grace, please.
Hi, Grace Farrenbowles, State Department. Thank you both for your comments today. My question is specifically on the deterrence of attacks in the Red Sea that have been occurring since October 7th. So my first question is, and I think one is that particularly relevant in the aftermath of the December ceasefire, is what is the likelihood of the Houthis actually stopping attacks if a ceasefire does happen, given some of the challenges you laid out with popular legitimacy and regional legitimacy, given their support for the Palestinian cause? And then secondly, given the ongoing attacks in the Red Sea, what is your assessment of the failures or the drivers of the failures of Operation SPDs and Operation Prosperity Guardian? And given your pessimism of military pressure on the Houthis, what is the actual what is the potential for actually hampering attacks going forward?
Let me start out. Tough questions from one of my own. That's cool. I think it would be foolhardy to hazard a guess as to what the Houthis will do if there's a ceasefire in Gaza. We definitely want that. We get a lot of input from countries and groups that have some inside knowledge on that question. And most of the assurance comes that the Houthis will, in fact. This is why they're doing this, because of Gaza. They've said that they will stop. And so we do get some feedback from insiders saying that will be what the Houthis do. Even if they do that, though, they've still demonstrated the capability to menace shipping, and they have the willingness to do it. So the United States is not going to say, oh, okay, game over. We're in a nice calm phase now. That's a long-term problem. I know it's very much on the minds of regional countries like Saudi Arabia and Oman and others, having demonstrated the capability. What will prevent them from using it in the future? And that's where we have to be creative about imposing enough safeguards and constraints so that the Houthis will think twice about going that route. if there is a ceasefire in Gaza, of course there are going to be roadblocks, there are going to be hiccups, there are going to be obstacles in the way. It's not going to go smoothly. I think we could all agree that that's going to happen. Does that then provide a pretext for the Houthis to relaunch attacks because the Gaza ceasefire isn't being implemented properly, or the Danes or some other country has a Quran burning in that country? Does that mean the Houthis therefore attack Danish ships? Not picking on the Danes, it just happened to pop into my mind because it's happened. But that's the kind of thing where I think the international community is going to say, no way, this is not the new normal. And we're going to be, I think, very focused. Again, this has to be a mutual effort. It's not just the United States. You mentioned Prosperity Guardian, these other shipping or maritime forces that are out there. They're doing a good job. The Auspides, the European Union's maritime coalition, was essential in providing security escort for the burning tanker these last couple of days, and having communication with the Houthis that I think was very effective. But neither of these coalitions, Prosperity Guardian or the European, is stopping the smuggling of goods, and lethal equipment into Yemen. And so that is a big problem that we have to address, is how do the Houthis continue to resupply? And we have to, that's something we've got to get after.
Yeah, I mean, I have a bit of a different view. I think if Gaza conflict is ended, and I hope it would for the sake of people there, the Houthis will not stop using the Red Sea. Maybe for a different reason. I mean, there will always be something. They discovered that they could actually terrorize the whole international shipping. And even though the strikes were, the US and UK strikes were precise, and it did really degrade some of the capabilities of the Houthis, but it convinced them that they could still use it as a weapon to pressure the international community. And I could think of so many issues other than Gaza that the Houthis want to get by just playing pirates and playing terrorists in the Red Sea.
Now, if the audience will permit me, I kind of want to end this conversation on a more optimistic note. And Mr. Ambassador, one of the problems I think that Yemen has in the United States, in Europe, frankly, even in the Arab world, is that very few people know about Yemen, very few people think about Yemen very often. And one small example of teaching people about Yemen is currently at the National Museum of Asian Arts at the Smithsonian, an exhibit of antiquities and frankincense dealing with Yemeni culture. How can you, as the ambassador, or how can the international community make more people aware of Yemen, what its culture is, and what its people are going through, and what efforts on public diplomacy, frankly, do you think would be productive to get more Americans to understand this conflict in your country?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, and my job is easier because I have 400,000 ambassadors here in the United States. We have a huge community in New York, San Francisco, in Michigan. I mean, and I advise and I hope that if you want to know more about Yemen, go and ask about Yemen from the Yemeni people. I mean, we have two strong women here that represent Yemen, Nadwa and Amat Ali Masouswan, and I think reaching out to the Yemeni diaspora and Yemenis here would give you a really great glimpse of how Yemen is. You mentioned culture. Of course, the embassy been, with the help of the State Department, of course, working in the vein of preserving our culture that is actually one of the victims of this war. And we've been successful with the help of the US government in signing a historic agreement last year to preserve this culture and antiquities. We've managed to repatriate so many artifacts in the Smithsonian's and in the Metropolitan in New York. And I'm happy to announce that just next month, Tim and I will be attending a ceremony of repatriating another 40, next week. Yeah, it is this month, we're going Friday. Next week, we're actually having a ceremony in the Metropolitan Museum to celebrate the return of 14 beautiful items from New Zealand to the United States. They will be hosted on loan from the government of Yemen in the Metropolitan Museum and ready to go back home as soon as we end this war. And I think I encourage everybody to go and visit the museums and ask about these items, ask about these artifacts, and ask about our vast history that didn't start with the Houthis and will not end with the Houthis.
Tim, any comments on that?
It's a wonderful and beautifully rich country, great cultural heritage, its own scripts and languages and beauty. And these are moments, I think, when we haven't touched on that at all, except at the very end. But we'll all get to a point, I think, where we can visit Yemen in the future and experience that. It has a beautiful legacy, great history, and that's something common to all Yemenis, whatever political party you are from.
So, Mr. Ambassador, I will leave to you the final word for today. Would you like to sum up?
Well, thank you very much for your interest. I mean, I know you won't be here if you don't really want peace for Yemen. And I would just say this, Yemen has so much to offer. I think we just want Iran to leave us alone. We want us to be able to conduct our own business. We want us to be able to show the world how beautiful Yemen is and how prosperous our country could be in the region and in the world. And thank you very much for being here.
So I want to thank our two speakers, Ambassador Mohammed Hadrami, Special Envoy Tim Lenderking. Let's give them a round of applause. And I want to thank all of you for coming and supporting the work of the Arab Gulf States Institute to bring more light on Yemen. I will note that our website, agsiw.org, has a lot more on Yemen, both in writing and on video, and a lot more on things beyond Yemen as well. So thank you all very much. We hope to see you again soon at another one of our programs. Bye-bye.